Chapter 19, A Truth to Come to Terms With. The rest of the fall season was grueling as the boys rode and raced in weather that had again turned unusually cold and stormy. Joe's boat often finished third. He was struggling with his emotions, especially since Sula had died and his father had invited him to move home. Then he got a letter from Sequim. Charlie McDonald was dead too, killed in an automobile crash. Charlie had been an advisor and a teacher to Joe, the one adult who had stood by him when no one else had. Now he was gone, and Joe found himself unable to focus. His mind was almost never in the boat, and it showed in his rowing. But it didn't seem to matter. As far as Joe could tell, no one in the coach's motorboat was even paying attention to him anymore. But in fact, someone was watching him very closely. Joe had noticed that Pocock was riding along in the motorboat frequently these days, but he hadn't noticed where Pocock had been training his binoculars. When the boys returned to the shell house after Christmas break, Ulbrichsen warned them that they must be ready to take part in Washington's greatest and most grueling crew season. After months of talking about the Olympic year, it was finally here. On the first Monday of the new season, Joe was surprised to find his name listed among those in the number 1 varsity boat. He couldn't fathom why he had suddenly been promoted. As it turned out, it wasn't really much of a promotion. Ulbrichsen planned to spend the first few weeks working on technique and fundamentals, and he believed the boys would be more receptive if they were rowing with familiar crewmates. So Joe was back with the boys from freshman year, including Shorty Hunt and Roger Morris. Through January and into February, they rowed 6 days a week. They worked on individual weaknesses. When it wasn't snowing, it was clear, bitter, cold, and windy. Icicles dangled from the bow of the boat. They rowed anyway, with white knuckles and chattering teeth, some of them dressed in ragged sweatsuits, some in shorts and stocking caps. Occasionally, they staged short races against each other, and Joe's boat kept coming in third. The third boat kept coming in first. In general, Ulbrichsen was pleased. By late February, he was starting to form some solid ideas about what his Olympic boat would look like. One choice was obvious. No matter what, Bobby Mock, the clever, fiery coxswain from the previous year's JV crew, was going to be sitting in the stern. At 5'7" and 119 pounds, he was almost the perfect size for a coxswain. Pocock, in fact, designed his shells to perform best with a 120-pound coxswain. Despite his small frame, a coxswain had to be strong enough to steer the boat. He had to know enough about the oarsmen inside, their individual strengths and weaknesses, to get the most out of each rower at any given moment. And he had to have the force of character to inspire exhausted rowers to try harder, even when all seemed lost. Bobby Mock had proven he could do all this the previous year. He had a deep baritone voice that was surprising in a man so small, and he bellowed out commands with absolute authority. Most important, he was smart, and he knew how to use his smarts. Joe's situation, on the other hand, was only getting worse. In late February, he was dropped to the number 2 boat. On February 20th, rowing hard and in a heavy snow and a steady east wind, the first 2 boats came in about even. Joe's hopes rose, but a week later, Ulbrichsen moved him down to the number 3 boat. One stormy afternoon in early March, after practice, George Pocock tapped Joe on the shoulder and asked him to come up to the loft again. Upstairs, Pocock leaned over one side of a new shell and began to apply varnish to its upturned hull. Joe pulled a sawhorse to the other side and sat down on it, facing the older man. Pocock began saying he'd been closely watching Joe row for a while now, and that he was a fine oarsman. He'd noted a few technical faults, but that wasn't what he wanted to talk about. He said there were times when Joe seemed to think he was the only one in the boat. He rowed as if it were up to him to row the boat across the finish line all by himself. When a man rowed like that, Pocock said, he was bound to attack the water rather than work with it. Worse, he would not be able to let his crew help him row. The Englishman suggested that Joe think of a well-rowed race as a symphony, and himself as just one player in the orchestra. If one fellow in the orchestra was playing out of tune or playing at a different tempo, the whole piece would naturally be ruined. That's the way it was with rowing. What mattered more than how hard a man rowed was how well everything he did in the boat harmonized with what the other fellows were doing. And a man couldn't harmonize with his crewmates unless he opened his heart to them. He had to care about everyone on his crew. He had to give himself up to the rowing, but he had to do even more. He had to give himself up to his crewmates, too. If you don't like some fellow in the boat, Joe, you have to learn to like him, Pocock said. It has to matter to you whether he wins the race, not just whether you do. Pocock paused and looked up. Joe, when you really start trusting those other boys, Pocock said, you will feel a power at work within you that is far beyond anything you've ever imagined. Sometimes you will feel as if you just rode right off the planet and are rowing among the stars. The next day was a Sunday, and Joe took Joyce and drove over to a lot on Lake Washington where his father was building his new house. The land was right next to his brother Fred's house, and for the past few weekends, Joe had been helping his father work. The basement was nearly complete, and with the upstairs portion underway, Harry had moved the kids in downstairs. The basement was more like a cave than a house, but Harry had lugged in a wood stove, and it was warm and dry inside. As Joe worked with his father, hauling lumber down from the road in a driving rain, Joyce entertained the kids, playing card games and making fudge and cocoa on the stove. Playing mother to Thula's children was natural to Joyce. The children were grief stricken, and Harry's full time work on the house prevented him from giving them the attention they needed. Every instinct Joyce had led her to sweep them into her arms and care for them. But her feelings about Harry were different. Even though he treated Joyce pleasantly, inside she still seethed with resentment towards him. She could not forgive him for his failure to stand behind Joe for all those years. By late afternoon, after they had moved all the lumber into position, Joe stood outside on the dock by himself, staring out at the lake. The finish line for the Pacific Coast Regatta in April was a little less than a mile up the lake from there. He wondered if he would be in the varsity boat when it passed by this dock. A gust of wind struck him. Rain poured down on his face. He stared at the water, pondering what Pocock had told him the day before. Joe had spent the last 6 years making his own way in the world. Nothing was more frightening than allowing himself to depend on others. People let you down. People left you behind. Depending on people and trusting them got you hurt. But trust seemed to be at the heart of what Pocock was asking. Harmonize with the other fellows, he said. There was a kind of absolute truth in that. It was something Joe couldn't deny. He had to come to terms with it. He stood on the dock for a long time, gazing at the lake, oblivious to the rain. Then he turned and peered back at the house. Inside, the kids and Joyce and his father were all under one roof, sitting in front of the fire, waiting for him to come in. When he returned to the warm cave, he toweled dry, unpacked his banjo, and gathered the kids around him. He tuned the banjo carefully. Then he cleared his throat, cracked open a big white smile, and began to play and sing. One by one, the kids, then his father, and finally Joyce began to join in, singing along with him. By March 19th, Ulbrichsen figured he had found his best bet for an Olympic boat. He had still pegged it as the second boat on his chalkboard, but the boys in it were beginning to edge the first boat consistently. Bobby Mock was riding coxswain. Roger Morris was in the bow, followed by Chuck Day and Gordy Adam. In the engine room, Ulbrichsen had placed Johnny White at number 4, Stub McMillan in the 5 seat, and Shorty Hunt at number 6. Merton Hatch, another of Tom Bull's former freshmen, sat in the 7 seat. The star of last year's freshman crew, Don Hume, was the stroke oar. Joe was in the 3rd boat, and it looked as if he'd be staying there and staying home, not rowing in the Cal race or beyond. But then, on March 21st, he walked into the shell house and found his name on the chalkboard, sitting at seat number 7 in boat number 2, right between Shorty Hunt and Don Hume. He couldn't believe it. He didn't know if Pocock had talked to Ulbrichsen or Merton Hatch had simply messed up in some terrible way. Whatever the reason, he had his chance. He knew what he had to do. From the moment he stepped into the shell that afternoon, he felt at home. He liked these boys. He didn't know Gordy Adam and Don Hume well, but both made a point of welcoming him aboard. His oldest, most reliable shellhouse friend, Roger Morris, sitting up front in the boat, gave him a wave and shouted, "Hey, Joe, I see you finally found the right boat." His buddies from Grand Coulee, Chuck Day and Johnny White, were sitting up near the front too. When he saw Joe, Stub McMillan, his face alight, said, "Okay, this boat is going to fly now, boys." Shorty Hunt slapped him on the back and whispered, "Got your back, Joe."